What happens when you combine The Mandalorian with the sequel trilogy? You get a gold mine of potential. Now, what does that even mean? In the chronology of Star Wars, The Mandalorian takes place in the year 9 ABY, which is a whole 25 years before the events of The Force Awakens and The Last Jedi. A lot can happen in that time period. 25 years is a long-ass time. So how is it possible to connect these two stories? Well, the whole reason this video even exists is because of a quote from Jon Favreau that happened before the first season even came out. He said, "You come in on episode 7 and the First Order are not just starting out, they're pretty far along. So somehow things weren't necessarily managed as well as they could have been if the galaxy ended up in hot water again like that." The implication here is that somehow The Mandalorian will tie in with the First Order and the politics of the sequel trilogy. But how will this be done? We've had a whole first season already and the First Order hasn't been mentioned once. And it can't be mentioned. The First Order doesn't become an official organization until the year 21 ABY, a whole 12 years after the events of The Mandalorian. So this answer to this question can't be as simple as making the Imperial remnant to the First Order. So how else can The Mandalorian tie in with the sequel trilogy? Well, since the time period between Return of the Jedi and The Force Awakens is so large, there are dozens of different possibilities for how you can tie these two stories together. Now, there are definitely people out there who do not want these two stories to be tied together, and that's fine. Some people love that The Mandalorian is isolated from the Skywalker saga, and that it's its own story that really does stand on its own. I think there is still a way you can tie it into the large Star Wars galaxy and still remain mostly isolated. And I'll get into those ways in a bit, but I do briefly want to mention another group of people. There are definitely people who do not want The Mandalorian and the sequel trilogy to tie together because even the most minuscule mention of something related to the sequel trilogy will trigger them beyond belief. I vividly remember people getting triggered at Bill Burr's character because he mentioned Canto Bight in the 6th episode of the first season.
I can't believe that thing can fly. It's like a Canto Bight slot machine.
If I am Lucasfilm, these are the kinds of people you have to ignore. You're not going to tell a good story if every time you try and tell a story, it's going to be based off of the reactions of the previous story. And this is basically what the sequel trilogy was. People hated the prequels, so The Force Awakens was something very similar. People said The Force Awakens was a rehash of A New Hope, so The Last Jedi was a story that subverted expectations. People said The Last Jedi didn't feel like Star Wars, so The Rise of Skywalker brought back a lot of familiar elements. This is a terrible approach to storytelling, and look no further than the prequel trilogy. George told a very unique story with the prequels, and a lot of people hated them, sure, but instead of course correcting, he stuck with the story throughout the trilogy and with other stories like the Clone Wars. He doubled down on the world and the conflict of the prequels. So Lucasfilm, there may be some unfavorable aspects of the sequel trilogy, but don't discard them. Stick with them and try and flesh them out so more people can appreciate them. Back to The Mandalorian, again, there are definitely many different ways you can tie this story into the sequel trilogy, and I have a few ideas. However, I'm going to give myself a single very important rule. This rule is that these ideas cannot compromise the identity of this show. The Mandalorian is a space western. It's about the criminals of the universe and how they survive in this type of world. Obviously, if I really wanted to tie these two stories in together, I can have Mando go find Luke Skywalker and Baby Yoda and Ben Solo can train together, but this completely compromises the identity of the show. Also, one aspect of its identity is that the show does stand on its own. I know people who have watched The Mandalorian and none of the Star Wars movies, but the story still makes complete sense. I don't want to bring aspects of the wider Star Wars galaxy where you need to consume another story to fully understand The Mandalorian, but that doesn't mean you can't tie into another story. Moff Gideon mentioned the Siege of Mandalore in the Season 1 finale. Fans of the Clone Wars obviously know what this is, but the casual viewer doesn't need to know what it is to understand the story of The Mandalorian. So you can tie into other stories, but it cannot be fundamental to the story of The Mandalorian. That is my one rule. Enough with everything else, it's time for me to share my ideas. I have 3 ideas as to how I think these two shows can tie together, so let's begin. The first pitch is the most obvious one, that this remnant of the Empire that we saw in the first season will inevitably become part of the First Order. This is already what many people assumed when the show first started, but again, it isn't that simple. Now, since the sequel trilogy does close to no world building, I think it's time I give you all a First Order history lesson. For those of you who have played the Battlefront 2 campaign, you may have some idea of what I'm talking about. So after the Battle of Endor, Emperor Palpatine put into place his contingency plan. He held this belief that if he were to die, then his empire deserves to die with him. This was a very Sith-like mentality to have. He had a very select few generals and admirals that he disclosed to go to the unknown regions and rebuild a new empire there. The remaining portion of the empire would go to the Battle of Jakku, where they would die along with the forces of the New Republic. However, some of the Imperials survived and also rendezvoused into the unknown regions as well. So when it comes to the Imperials of the Mandalorian, if the Imperials are still wandering around the known galaxy, then it is likely that they are not a part of the First Order. However, you can still tie it in with the First Order. This remnant very well, for the most part, may not have a single clue about the larger Imperial remnant in the unknown regions, but the head of this remnant, whether it be Moff Gideon or someone higher in ranking that we haven't met, may know about the First Order. They may have just organized this small remnant as a means of serving the First Order. This would tie in with Baby Yoda most likely. It's obvious that the reason the Empire wants Baby Yoda is because of his connection with the Force. There is no way that is just a coincidence. Now, as people have speculated, the Doctor that we see in the first and third episode does have a connection with Kamino. The Kaminoans are the people in Attack of the Clones who made the clones for the Clone Wars. Maybe the First Order is trying to get Baby Yoda to clone him for whatever reason. Or maybe they just want to take Baby Yoda and make a Strandcast. A Strandcast is what Snoke is, a person that was artificially created. Mando actually thought Baby Yoda was a Strandcast, but Quill disagreed. So if this is what's gonna happen, then how would the story play out? Well, at some point in the series, whether it be now or at the end of the series, the Empire will be defeated and Baby Yoda will be free of them. Maybe at some point we see a conversation with Moff Gideon and someone involved with the First Order. Now this person can't be Palpatine because no one knew about Palpatine, but it could be Snoke. I think it would be pretty cool if in one episode in the last season they brought back Andy Serkis and gave Snoke a cameo. For those people who watched the show but hadn't seen the sequels, it wouldn't be too important because the show could just treat Snoke as the secret head of the entire remnant and as someone who Gideon reports to. It would inevitably be revealed that for whatever reason the Empire wants Baby Yoda, it would have to do with the First Order. The second idea that I have is actually my favorite, and it has to do with the New Republic. If you go back to the quote by Jon Favreau, he mentions how things weren't managed well if the galaxy fell into war again. Maybe instead of focusing on the rise of the First Order, maybe they could focus on the New Republic. For those of you who haven't followed the canon, the New Republic was a disaster. The Senate was corrupt and it was terribly run. One of the reasons the First Order was able to rise in the first place was because of how incompetent the New Republic was. Also, the New Republic had a very small military. They didn't want to have a large one because they felt it would remind people of the Empire. So since they had a very small military, the First Order was able to clean house no problem. This is also the reason why the Resistance existed in the first place, because Leia felt the New Republic was so incompetent. Now, how could this be explored in The Mandalorian? We only saw the New Republic once in the first season. Well, that's just it. It could be addressed how the New Republic is refusing to do anything about this Imperial remnant. Also, maybe a larger part of the galaxy could be out of control and for a short time the Imperial remnant would gain a significant amount of power, and it's the Mandalorians who end up taking them out, not the New Republic. The way this would tie into the sequel trilogy is because it would flesh out how the First Order was able to rise in the first place. If people watch The Mandalorian and see firsthand how incompetent the New Republic is, then they will watch the sequels and go, oh, no wonder the First Order rose to power, the New Republic sucks. Small things like that I think are really cool and could definitely help flesh out the world of the sequel trilogy. Now the last thing I want to talk about are the Nicktoes. And you may be wondering who the hell are the Nicktoes. The Nicktoes are actually the alien-looking dudes from the pilot. Another brief Star Wars history lesson. For most of the Star Wars history we know, the Nicktoes served the Hutts. We see this a little bit in the Clone Wars. However, after Jabba the Hutt died in Return of the Jedi, the Hutts fell apart and the Nicktoes took significant power in Hutt space. By the way, Hutt space is where all the gangs and criminal organizations reside. So in The Mandalorian, when we see the Nicktoes, they are probably already part of a major crime organization. One question that actually currently remains unanswered is why did the Nicktoes have Baby Yoda in the first place? Usually these criminal syndicates want money, so why wouldn't they just sell Baby Yoda to the Empire? Maybe the reason behind this all has to do with the First Order. Later on in the canon, the First Order actually does do some work with the Nicktoes, so maybe we will see some seeds of that as early in the timeline as this show. Since the First Order is in hiding, maybe they are hiring these syndicates to do some work for them. Now this idea is a difficult one to see happening because we haven't seen the Nicktoes since the first episode, and it looks like we won't be seeing them in season 2. So those are my ideas for how The Mandalorian can tie in with the sequel trilogy. As much as I do like the isolated nature of The Mandalorian, I do hope it ties in with the Skywalker saga in some way. So far, almost all the side stories we do have do tie in with the Skywalker saga in some way. The Clone Wars heavily fleshes out the Clone Wars, Rebels fleshes out the origins of the Rebellion, Solo doesn't really do anything but give backstory to Han, which he is an important character in the Skywalker saga, so I guess that counts. Rogue One obviously ties in very nicely with A New Hope, and I want The Mandalorian to do something similar. I just think it would really add something to the Skywalker saga, and it would definitely add more layers to The Mandalorian if it did tie in with the overall narrative. For those of you who watched this video, thank you so much for watching. If you want to see more of me, then you can go check me out on Star Wars Only's channel because we do the Tatooine show most Fridays. If you don't want to watch us on YouTube, we are available on Spotify and iTunes, so you can get the audio only version there. Also, I now have a second channel called Goldman is Live, and this channel holds all my older streams if you are interested in watching them. One more thing, for each new episode of the second season of The Mandalorian, I will be reacting to it on this channel at 9 AM Eastern Time on Friday, so if you're interested in watching it, you know when you can find it. I hope everyone has a wonderful day. Please don't forget to like and subscribe if you haven't already, and also leave a comment. It would really help out with this video. Again, thank you guys so much for watching, and I'll see you guys next time.